Today we are looking at a case from the late 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Roxalana Druse was born in 1847 near the small town of Herkimer, which is situated close to the Mohawk River in Herkimer County, New York. She was christened Roxalana Theft, and everyone referred to her as Roxana. She was a pretty girl and had many admirers, so it came as a surprise to many when in 1864 she married a farmer named William Druse, who was 18 years her senior. Not only was William considerably older than Roxana, he seemed very different to his bride. She was a lively and outgoing young lady, while he was considered to be a rather dull and uninspiring gentleman. They moved to the small town of Warren, where William had a farm and a small house. Over the next 20 years, Roxalana gave birth to 2 children, a girl who they named Mary and a son they named George. Roxalana and William's relationship was not a good one. During their marriage, William had become increasingly more miserable, and the small house they lived in was not in a good state of repair. By 1884, the couple's daughter Mary had just turned 19, and their son George was 10. Also living in the house was William's 14-year-old nephew named Frank Gates. Frank did many of the chores, as William had become a lazy individual and was known in the town as a good-for-nothing man who didn't work very hard. There were rumours that he was an abusive husband who didn't like his wife venturing too far from their secluded farmhouse. The family's sleeping arrangements were also somewhat strange, as Roxalana and Mary slept downstairs in the parlour, while William, George and Frank all slept upstairs in the bedrooms. Most of the days were the same. Roxalana and Mary would spend their time preparing the food, keeping the house tidy, and doing the lighter chores around the farm, while Frank and William undertook the more strenuous tasks. Thursday, December the 18th, 1884, started like any other day. William got dressed and came downstairs. He lit the fire and went outside to inspect the farm. His wife stayed in the kitchen preparing breakfast. There had been a quarrel between them, as William had not paid for some groceries, and this had displeased his wife. The children noticed the tension between their parents, so when William returned to the house, Roxalana instructed Frank and George to go and see what needed doing outside. Although the day started like any other, it didn't continue that way, and William Druse was never seen again. Later that day, neighbours spotted dense smoke coming from the Druse farmhouse. They also noticed that this was accompanied by a strange smell. Strangely, none of them thought that it was worthy of further investigation. As the days went by, it became apparent that no one had seen William for some time. When questioned on the subject, Roxalana would say that her husband had gone to New York City, and as it was known that he occasionally spent periods away from the farm, everyone seemed to accept her explanation. Soon after, however, rumours began to circulate that something untoward had happened to William Druse. When Roxalana was again approached on the subject, she continued to say that her husband had gone away and started to take offence to any suggestions that there had been any other reason for William's absence. But as the weeks passed, people started to become concerned. Surely he would not have just abandoned his farm and his family. Neighbours continued to inquire as to whether Mr. Druse had returned. Some were anxious as they needed to discuss important matters with him, and when one particularly concerned gentleman visited the house to further ask about William, he noticed that the floor of the farmhouse had been newly painted. He started to think that the fact no one had seen William and the strange way that Roxalana was going about her business, something was not quite right. His observations only increased the speculation in the town that Roxalana knew more about her husband's sudden disappearance than she was letting on. Although William was not a particularly well-liked person and spent very little time in conversation when buying provisions in the town, he was always polite and courteous. No one would have wished him any harm. People started to imagine what could have happened to him, and as the rumours intensified, the district attorney agreed to launch an official inquiry to try and ascertain the whereabouts of William Druse. The inquiry was conducted by the Herkimer district attorney, a gentleman named A.B. Steele. The first thing he did was to arrest the missing man's nephew, Frank Gates. He was the obvious person to question first, as he was not directly related to Mrs. Druse. It was now January the 16th, 1885, and Mr. Steele, a skilled attorney, questioned young Frank Gates. It didn't take long before Frank started telling a macabre tale about what had happened on the morning of December the 18th, 1884, in the farmhouse owned by his uncle, Mr. William Druse. He said that that morning, Mrs. Druse was not in good spirits and was upset with her husband for not paying a grocery bill. Mr. Druse was a man of few words and continued to eat his breakfast. Mrs. Druse and Mary were in the kitchen when Mrs. Druse went to the parlour. She returned with a gun under her apron. Frank then said that she told him and George to go outside, but to stay close by. He then heard 2 gunshots before Mrs. Druse came to the door and told them both to come back inside. Frank told the district attorney that he then saw Mr. Druse lying on the floor. It seemed that Mary had put a rope around him while he was eating breakfast and had pulled him backwards on his chair. Mrs. Druse then gave him the gun and instructed him to shoot his uncle. Fearing that he may suffer the same fate, he did as she asked. He added that Mr. Druse then rolled forward, at which point Mrs. Druse fetched the axe. She looked down at her husband, and Mr. Druse turned his head and whispered, "Oh, Roxy, don't." But Mrs. Druse raised the axe above her head, and with all the force that she could muster, brought it down upon her husband. At this point, Frank told the district attorney, but he realised his uncle, Mr. William Druse, was dead. Frank continued telling District Attorney Steele the horrifying story. He said that he then helped Mrs. Druse take the body of her husband into the parlour. She then sent him and George to fetch a sharper axe. They did as she asked. Following this, she instructed them to make up the fire. Meanwhile, Mrs. Druse stayed in the parlour. She would then appear with pieces of her husband's body, which she threw on the fire to burn, and this continued throughout the day. Frank said that later, she asked him to saw the handle from the axe and place it on the fire. The next morning, he and Mrs. Druse took the ashes and dumped them in a nearby swamp. Not wanting to dispose of everything there, they walked to a pond and threw in the gun and the axe. They then waited to see them both sink to the bottom. When the district attorney asked Frank why he had not confessed to this previously, Frank replied that Mrs. Druse had said that if anyone spoke of it, they would suffer the same fate as her husband. Following the confession, the swamp and pond were searched. It did not take long for the axe blade and the gun to be found, and small pieces of bone were recovered from the swamp. Experts concluded that these were human. Mrs. Roxalana Druse was then arrested. When her 10-year-old son was questioned, he told a slightly different story to Frank, as he said that also present was his uncle Charles Gates, who was Frank's father. George said that it was he who gave his mother the gun. Mrs. Druse claimed that Mr. Charles Gates was not only present, but in fact responsible for killing her husband, as he had fired the shots. However, the district attorney did not believe that anyone else was present and charged Roxalana Druse with the murder of her husband. Her children, Mary and George, along with her nephew Frank, were charged with aiding the accused into committing a felony and murder. They were all taken to the jail at Herkimer. The trial of Roxalana Druse began at Herkimer on Monday the 21st of September 1885. The story of a wife who killed her husband, dismembered his body, then burnt it piece by piece in the kitchen stove, fascinated the public, and journalists fed the reader's interest in the story by writing about it every day. The fact that Roxalana had committed the crime was never in dispute, but her lawyers told the court that the defendant had suffered years of emotional and physical abuse from her husband, and on the day of the crime, she was suffering from temporary insanity. Many witnesses were called, including her nephew Frank Gates and her son George Druse, as well as friends and neighbours. One neighbour, named William Elwood, told the court that he called at the Druse farmhouse on Thursday the 18th of December, but despite loudly knocking on the door, no one answered. He said that the windows were covered with newspaper and that thick smoke was coming from the chimney. Roxalana decided not to testify, leaving it up to her attorneys to try and convince the jury that the crime was committed in an act of self-defence. On Saturday the 3rd of October, the judge sent the jury out to deliberate. When they returned, the judge asked the jury foreman if they found the defendant guilty or not guilty. The foreman replied, "Guilty," and the judge sentenced Roxalana Druse to death by hanging. The execution date was set for the following Tuesday, the 6th of October. Her sentence was appealed, and each time her execution was delayed. Eventually it was set for the 28th of February 1887. During the 14 months between her trial and final execution date, Roxalana's case had been intensively reported, and public opinion seemed to favour the court commuting her sentence. Women's rights campaigners opposed the verdict and made the point that as the jury was all male, it was not a jury of her peers. In spite of all the support she received, the governor of New York refused to change the sentence. It was reported that the day before she was taken to the gallows, Roxalana told her spiritual advisor that it was in fact her brother-in-law, Charles Gates, who convinced her to do away with her husband, and it was he who gave her the gun. She said that on the day of the murder, he had been hiding by a window, and after she had fired the first shot, he fired the following 3. She also claimed that it was Charles who burned the body. Roxalana also told the authorities that her daughter Mary was totally innocent and had nothing to do with the crime. On Monday the 28th of February 1887, Mrs. Roxalana Druse was taken to the gallows, where she became the last woman hanged in the state of New York. Hanging was then replaced by the electric chair. Her daughter Mary had been sentenced to life in the penitentiary in Syracuse. However, 10 years after being sentenced, she was pardoned and released. Both Frank and George were spared custodial sentences on the account of their age. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case